Good afternoon. I'm Steven Ezel. I'm the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and we're delighted to have you with us this afternoon for the release of the report, Innovate4Health, How Innovators Are Solving Global Health Challenges, which has been the product of a year-long collaboration between ITIF and the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University to develop 25 case studies profiling how innovators predominantly from the developing world are solving health challenges in their countries. As we get started today, I want to extend a hearty thanks to the Global Innovation Policy Center for securing the venue here at the Meridian International Center, and to thank Meridian for extending word of our event throughout their network in DC. So I'll make panelist introductions at this point, and then turn it over to my colleague Mark Schultz, who will introduce the I4H report. Then I'll make a few remarks and we'll turn it back to the panel. But first we're going to hear today from Professor Mark Schultz, who is a professor of law at Southern Illinois University, as well as co-founder of the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property. Mark's research focuses on the law and economics of the global intellectual property system, and he has done groundbreaking works on developing a trade secret protection index. Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a real privilege to work on this report with Steve and ITIF, and I do have to also acknowledge David Lunn of CPIP, who really led the team, the research team, as well as our many research assistants and associates who drafted these case studies. So, the reason Steve and I became interested in doing this report was because we've both been involved in discussions of innovation and global health for many years. And there are certain contexts of that discussion, the certain parts of that public policy discussion where people solely equate the discussion of innovation and global health challenges with drug R&D. And furthermore, there's all too often a belief that, or an implicit understanding that health innovation is something that happens in laboratories in wealthy countries, that's done by big companies. And what we knew, what we understood, was that there was innovation happening everywhere. Innovation tackling important global health challenges being done on the ground, close to the point of care, by innovators in all countries. And we thought that this was a potentially exciting story to tell. So we started to tell it. And the way we decided to do it was in some ways from the bottom up. We decided to start publishing case studies on a blog. And so what we did by doing that over the past year is we were able to find out about technologies from people who found out about our project. And there's so many people who are passionate about their own inventions, about inventions of people with whom they've worked, that we kept finding out about more and more. We could easily do a sequel or two with all of the projects we found out about. And it's really inspiring and exciting. And as I said, one of the things we found, and Steve's going to talk a little bit more about the takeaways and the lessons we learned. I'm going to describe some of the case studies. One of the things we learned is innovation is happening everywhere. So this is a map that shows where where our case studies were focused, where these innovations have arisen and are being deployed. And looking at this map, you see that this is a different map from how we would often think of, global innovation. What we were talking about isn't just happening in Europe or the US. Often it gets a boost from people working in the US or doing their university research in the US, but this technology is being deployed on the ground throughout the world. In doing these case studies, what we found were we were able to group them into roughly 6 categories. I'm not going to stand here and read the slide to you. You can see them for yourself, and they're in the report. But I think what the 6 categories tend to demonstrate is that there are a host of challenges to be addressed, and we found out about more challenges than we knew about when we started, but it's a very hopeful and exciting way to find out about challenges, to discover more about challenges as you find out how they're being solved. And so we're able to tell this story about the myriad of on-the-ground challenges that people are meeting. And I'm going to focus on 2 and give you some examples of case studies of challenges and case studies of solutions that met them. So, one of the big challenges in the world is access to health care. But of course, the question is what you mean when you say access to health care. Sometimes people mean it costs too much, or they can't get the doctor they want. That's not what we mean in much of the world. In much of the world, people just don't have access to health care, period, because they live in remote places or otherwise. And so one of the challenges is getting the health care to where the people are. Because it's really hard for people in much of the world to get to where there are doctors. And indeed, in many instances where there are doctors, there are shortages of specialists. The entire country of Ethiopia has a single radiation center for treatment of cancer, for example. So it's, this equipment is not widely distributed, not easy to get to. So what innovators are doing is finding ways to get the health care to the people. So here's a particular challenge. Vaccines. Vaccines have to be kept cold, or they spoil. They have to be kept at a steady cold temperature. And every year, 1.5 million children die of diseases that vaccines could have prevented. The problem is getting the vaccines to those kids where they live. And when you think about some parts of the world, it's really hard to keep stuff cool. The refrigeration isn't there because the electricity isn't there. The roads aren't friendly to transport. And so the Gates Foundation, teaming up with Intellectual Ventures, developed a super thermos, a patented super thermos that passively keeps vaccines cool for 30 to 60 days. What does that mean? It means they put in ice once and they stay cool from then on. It's super insulated. Bill Gates referred to this as the keg of life. And indeed, it can hold vaccines for dozens of children. And it also has other functions. It can monitor the quality of the temperature, make sure that there have been no extremes or deviations. It transmits that information back to care providers so people can be assured they're getting quality vaccines. There have been studies that have found that in many developing countries, absent this kind of technology, the majority of vaccines administered don't meet quality standards because of the cold chain problem. So ArcTech is helping to solve that problem. Another issue is visual impairment. Hundreds of millions have vision problems. Hundreds of millions of people in the world that could be fixed or relieved if they're addressed sufficiently early. And 90% of people with visual impairments live in the developing world. Once again, we face the problem, though. People can't get to the eye doctor. And the equipment that we in the US would experience is expensive. Kenya has only 86 ophthalmologists for 40 million people. And so the creator of Peak, who was working in Kenya, decided to bring the eye exam equipment to where people are. They created a clip-on camera and an app that can be operated by community workers. It can scan over 1,000 patients a week, send data to a care provider, and screen for conditions like glaucoma and other deteriorating eye conditions that, if addressed early, can save eyesight. Another challenge is cancer. Cancer is not just a developed world disease. Over half of all new cases in the developing world on a yearly basis, over half of all of the new cancer cases arise in the developing world on a yearly basis now. As healthcare improves, people's outcomes, health outcomes improve, they live longer. Unfortunately, they're also now beginning to experience cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other challenges. Now, with respect to cancer, it's once again, early detection is key, and diagnostics are often very difficult when people live in remote areas, when expensive equipment isn't available. The company Miraculous developed this cancer screening tool. It consists of a camera, a computer, and a testing substrate, where they take blood and it's assayed for the presence of particular microRNA. This kit has been deployed in the field, and its creators have seen people use 3D printing combined with smartphones in order to deploy the technology. So it's very friendly to challenging environments and democratizes cancer care. Now, one thing that's interesting about this too, and several of these solutions we profile, is that innovation flows both directions from the global north to the global south. And that's something people often don't acknowledge in public policy debates. And so here, some of the innovations we profile are now being deployed in wealthy countries, and why not? Care is expensive, machinery is expensive. If you can find a solution like this, you can help people at a much more affordable cost. Another challenge I'd like to address is the challenge of infrastructure. In many parts of the world, infrastructure is difficult. It creates difficult conditions for medical care. And one example of a difficult condition is unreliable electricity. Think of going to a hospital or clinic and how much of what surrounds you runs on electricity. If there's no electricity supply, or if it's unreliable, you don't have reliable health care. And so these two particular case studies I'm going to talk about next address the problem of a lack of electricity. The first is the Embrace infant warmer. So preterm birth is the leading cause of death for children under 5 years worldwide. And each year, 15 million children are born before being full term at 37 weeks. And of those, 1 million die before they're 5 years old because of complications. Now, in developed countries, we've reached the point where almost all children born after 32 weeks survive. But in developing countries, that statistic is 1/2. Half of all children born after 32 weeks pass away. One of the issues they face is not being able to be warm enough. They have hypothermia. And if you've ever seen a preemie unit at a hospital in the US, they have these warming units. Well, if you don't have reliable electricity, those don't work. So what the Embrace infant warmer uses advanced material science to create what is a simple device. They use what are called temperature regulating phase change materials. They can charge them, so they just need a battery or an occasional access to power, and they can stay warm for up to 4 hours without additional electricity. These blankets have been employed so far for over 200,000 infants across 20 countries. This is a fundamental life-saving device, and it functions in the absence of electricity. A similar problem exists with respect to oxygen machines. Pneumonia is a cause of death for 18% of children who, under the age of 5 who die from pneumonia. And one of the things they need is they need oxygen. And of course, if you lack access to electricity, you don't have a functioning oxygen machine. So the creators of the FreeO2 siphon oxygen machine cleverly used the action of water and the differential pressure provided by water to create an effective oxygen machine that can deliver oxygen to a patient without electricity. So, Steve will talk about lessons learned, but what I want to leave you is what we found is that there are so many exciting things happening. There are clever innovators, brilliant innovators all over the world who are making a real difference. And as Steve will tell you, so often they rely on intellectual property rights to secure their investments to help them be able to bring their products to market. And it's also important to remember that innovation isn't just for rich countries or big companies. It's entrepreneurs on the ground, close to the problems, are innovating in healthcare and making a difference. So thanks. Steve?
Well, thanks, Mark, for that great introduction to the report and several of the case studies. So I'll share some lessons learned and common themes that emerged from across the case studies, and then turn it over to our panelists. So as Mark talked about, certainly it is true that developing countries have unique healthcare challenges, and we profile a number of cases in the report that are addressing exactly that. We were hopeful to have Mr. Eddie Agbo from Nigeria, who is the founder of a company called Odor Biotechnology. Unfortunately, Skype is not working with us this afternoon. I was once told never to do a presentation with technology or live animals. I heedlessly forgot that lesson today. So let me take a minute to try and describe for you what Odor is doing, because what he has done is build a $2 malaria testing kit that is the first point-of-care testing kit for malaria, which does not require a blood sample or a trained physician to administer. It takes the malaria sample from the urine stream. It can return results in 25 minutes, and it has decreased the cost of malaria testing by about 85%. And this is phenomenal because 445,000 people, mostly children, die each year from malaria still in sub-Saharan Africa. And as Eddie would have told you, and he quoted to us in the report, the $2 at-home test is the perfect counter to claims that intellectual property rights, specifically patents, result in expensive healthcare and a lack of access to necessary medical services. Eddie said, in fact, IP rights have made a quick, efficient, low-cost, and convenient testing for malaria a reality in Africa. Other studies in the report, there's a cool one on a company called Nanobiozyme, and it has developed a gene radar technology that can provide real-time Zika testing results in the field. So before, if you were worried about having Zika, you had to take the blood test, send it away, get results 4 to 5 weeks later. This company has innovated a solution and gives you real-time feedback in the field. So we have taken a lot of effort in the report to profile those types of innovations that deal specifically with developing country challenges, but I think it's also important to recognize that global health challenges are increasingly commonly shared. As Mark suggested, in fact, by the year 2020, fully 70% of the fatalities that occur in developing countries will come from non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. In fact, even today, citizens of low and middle income countries bear 80% of the world's death burden from cardiovascular disease, and heart disease is the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa for citizens over the age of 30. And in fact, when it comes to cancer, developing world accounts for half of all new case studies annually. So the point is that we need smart people in developed and developing countries who are working on solving challenges currently unsolved by medical science. And we need to preserve incentives, including intellectual property rights, that are going to encourage them to take on those challenges. Mark has talked about the challenge of access, but I want to provide a few more comments on that as well. The reality is that in a number of cases, we've actually already invented the solutions, but we need to improve the healthcare infrastructure, distribution, training, and access to get drugs, vaccines, and medical supplies to the people who need them. In fact, more than 1.5 million children die every year from diseases that existing vaccines could already prevent if we could just get it into their hands. Similarly, when it comes to what are called essential medicines, this is a group of drugs that the World Health Organization has deemed essential providing healthcare in developing countries. Fully 95% of these drugs are already off patent and therefore potentially available in generic forms. Yet a 2014 study from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands found that essential medicines are available in public sector facilities in developing countries only 40% of the time. So we have the drugs. How can we get them to the people who need them? And I wanted to profile a couple of the case studies that I thought spoke directly to that, because the reality is that innovators are creating unique solutions to these challenges. The first is a company called Zipline in Rwanda, which operates a fleet of 21 Zip drones, which can provide real-time delivery of emergency medical supplies for 2/3 of Rwandans, 8 million of their 12 million citizens. The topography, the terrain in Rwanda is very hilly, it's very mountainous. It can take as long as 4 hours to go from a central hospital to a field clinic. Drones can get, if you need a blood transfusion. The case study talks about a number of instances of women who've had ectopic pregnancies, they need an immediate blood transfusion. This Zipline has saved lives. And it's also kind of facilitated the development of more agile, adaptable supply chains within Rwanda, and also meant in a number of cases, if a certain vaccine or drug had to have very particular storage conditions, it was difficult to store this in the field, but now they have the technology to get the drugs to where they need to be. Not only that, Rwanda became the first country in Africa to put in place drone regulations. So they're actually now a leader in kind of regulatory and innovation policy because they knew they had to get the rule set right for drones to exist if this solution was going to come to fruition. So it's a great example. Another one of my favorite case studies from the report was the CardioPad. And the CardioPad was the invention of this gentleman, Mr. Arthur Zhang, then a 28-year-old Cameroonian engineer who invented and received a patent for the world's first medical tablet enabling remote heart examinations and diagnosis. He wanted to tackle the challenge that despite the fact that there are 23 million Cameroonians, there are only 50 cardiologists in the entire country, all located in the capital city, Yaoundé, or the largest city, Douala. And so he had the thought that he could leverage technology, and the way the CardioPad works is in pairs. So a doctor at a field clinic will attach the leads to the patient to take the electrocardiogram. It's sent to a paired device in the capital where the cardiologist is, and in this way they can provide remote cardiac care for 50 people to a population of 23 million. An absolutely fantastic innovation. Not only that, the CardioPad was designed attuned to local conditions. It's humidity resistant. It's designed to be easy to use for healthcare physicians who may not be well trained. And in a country where a typical examination of cardiac care in the past took $40 while citizens earn just $5 a day, he's been able to decrease the cost of giving these exams by about 75%, so really increasing affordability. Peppered throughout all of these case studies is the message and testimony to the reality that intellectual property rights, far from being an impediment or hindrance to access to medicines, is actually vital to the very existence of those medicines and other innovative healthcare solutions in the first place. We talk in the report about how IPRs create incentives for innovation. There's also a number of cases of the innovators talking about how receiving the intellectual property rights meant that they could focus on innovating and developing their technology, not on protecting their IP. In fact, Arthur Zhang is quoted in the pages as saying, "Patents enable you to protect yourself against rivals who simply want to copy your work." And he further notes that the intellectual property system in Africa has helped give credibility to African products and been a key validator for entrepreneurs as they go out to secure financing. Of course, as we know, IPRs also induce knowledge spillovers that help others to innovate. And great new work from the OECD, a good study called Policy Complements and the Strengthening of IPRs in Developing Countries, finds that enhanced levels of IPR can actually increase domestic levels of exports, R&D, and foreign direct investment. So I want to close with one final case study before turning it over to our panelist. This is a case study derived from a journal article written by a former professor of mine, Michael Ryan at Georgetown. The article was called Patent Incentives, Technology Markets, and Public-Private Biomedical Innovation Networks in Brazil. But the point is, this plant here, Cordia verbernacea, I thought I was going to nail that and I just missed it. Cordia verbernacea. And it is a perennial bush plant that grows widely along the southeastern coast of Brazil. For decades and even centuries, local fishermen in Brazil have used the plant mashed up into oil directly on sprains or cuts as an anti-inflammatory and anti-scarring medicine to aid in healing. In the 1980s, Brazil's largest manufacturer of branded generics, H Laboratories, knew about this compound, and in fact, they made some cursory efforts to try to isolate the chemical compound in the 1980s, but they recognized that Brazil's lack of pharmaceutical patent rights meant that they would be unable to protect their IPR and investments if they were able to successfully isolate the compound. So they decided to delay doing so. In 1996, Brazil, to come into compliance with TRIPS, introduced pharmaceutical product patent rights. And the implication of this for the managers at H was that they realized they could finally invest in innovative medicinal product development, such as the Cordia project, because the stronger IP rights enshrined in Brazil's new patent law gave them confidence that the risky and expensive investments to develop the active ingredient could be protected should they succeed. They went ahead and did so. Within a decade, Achiflan captured a 30% share of the global over-the-counter market for anti-inflammatories. But in other words, essentially, the strengthening of IP rights gave Brazilian innovators opportunity and incentive to tap into commercializing the rich ecological diversity of the country to produce new medicines for the benefit of the world. But yet that sat on the shelf for 15 years when it could have been brought to market because innovators didn't have their IP rights protected. So at the end of the day, from the perspective of ITIF, and I think the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property, the reality is that the only resource in the world which is inexhaustible and inextinguishable is the human mind and its vast capacity for ingenuity. And intellectual property rights, far from being an impediment, actually play a fundamental and vital role toward helping solve global health challenges. So thank you. Those are my remarks. Let me now introduce our three panelist speakers. I'll ask them to come to the stage, give their presentations, and then when they're done, we'll sit down and have a moderated Q&A session. But we're first going to hear from Mr. Sathya Alumalai. He is the co-founder and CEO of MultiSensor Diagnostics, which, as he will tell us, is developing an innovation called MouthLab that non-invasively measures more than 10 vital health parameters in 30 seconds for facilitating management of chronic diseases in patients at home. We'll next hear from Adli Abdul Karim, who is the managing partner and co-founder of the Electronic Health Network. This is a health information exchange technology that the company has been developing. Adli has been involved in global data exchange in healthcare since 2011. And last but not least, we'll hear from Mr. Patrick Kilbride, who is a senior vice president at the Global Innovation Policy Center, where he oversees their work on intellectual property and the global, the international IP index. So with that, thank you. And Sathya, let me turn the floor to you.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. As he introduced, we are part of MultiSensor Diagnostics, where our mission of the company is to empower personalized care, and we wanted to bring patient-centered care or access to high-quality patient-centered care to the palm of your hand. So, I think I wanted to probably tell you more about my mom's condition, or the reason why I started working on this company is because of my mom. She's 65-year-old, suffering from multiple chronic condition. In addition to all her meds and inhalers and therapies that she needs to go through every single day, she also has to measure herself with multiple devices like blood pressure, cuff, weighing scale, thermometers, and all those different things. It generally takes her 12 to 15 minutes, and she definitely did not do it every day. I mean, the doctor prescribed her to do it every day, but she does not do it because she's alone, and the devices are very complicated and difficult for her to use it every single day. And it's lacking adherence. Although it showed value, it significantly lacks adherence. But imagine if she can, like every single day, she gets up in the morning, brushes her teeth, she picks up a device and then breathes through the device for 30 seconds without have to do anything different. All she has to do is, like, she spends 2 minutes brushing her teeth. All we ask her is, like, spend 30 seconds to breathe through a device. And what it does to her is, like, it measures more than 10 different vital health parameters in 30 seconds. I mean, I can show you a quick video and I can continue talking about it. Yeah.
I'm MultiSensor. I'm the CEO and co-founder of MultiSensor Diagnostics. At MultiSensor Diagnostics, we developed a single device that measures 10 different health parameters in under a minute. We put together a cadre of tools that are essential for managing chronic disease patients at home. It's a simple device. You have to put it in your mouth and then you have to breathe through normally. We have proprietary sensors, technology, and algorithm that captures everything in real time and sends it to the cloud. In the long run, it helps identify early signs of clinical deterioration or disease progression. 1 minute of your day to get a comprehensive health assessment.
Thank you. I felt like that was much more easier to explain what our product is. But basically, the thing is, imagine what it can do to her life. Today, like with all these oversights and all these medications and devices that she has to go through, it also it's providing value. It significantly reduces her quality of life. And if she can use this device, it not only helps her, but also like help our health system and our providers to proactively manage. But because the thing is, today she's living like at least 40 minutes from her doctor, or like almost an hour from her physician's office in the US. But look at the situation, like, and she's not alone here. Like, there's over 50 million patients in the US who are similar to her. But globally, if you look at it, there's more than 200 million patients who have such issues, and then they don't have access to such technology. I mean, I was born and brought up in India, and I've seen both sides of the world, like where there's a huge disparity in terms of healthcare in India, where there's no devices there, or there's always difficulty. Even if there is an issue, it's always like procrastinated. Okay, I'll take care of it later, or I will not do it because of the cost associated with it, or the no access. So that's what we wanted to do, is like bring this device, bring the access to healthcare. So if we can put this device in a lot of people's home, it'll be much more easier, not only for somebody who's sick to manage themselves, but also others who are susceptible to other conditions. And we're not just stopping here. In US, we're working with different stakeholders like providers to help them out to better manage their patients at home. We're working with pharma to also reduce the cost of clinical trials, the time it takes for clinical trials, because oftentimes, like once a patient comes into the hospital, they go back and it takes at least a few weeks before they actually see the doctor again. So in this time frame, a lot of things are missed. So we're collecting a lot more data points that are much more valuable to predict something at an early stage before we identify something is wrong with the drug, or before we identify it has an effect on the patient. So we're working on that. But from on a global front, we are working with, specifically we started working with India, I mean, since I had some connections, and I really saw there's a value to start up somewhere where I started my life. So we are working with 2 major health systems in India where we are putting this device as a part of a mobile health clinic. So there's an organization called Hinduja Group where they have a huge health system. What they do is like they have a huge Harvey that has pretty much everything in there, like from a surgical facility all the way to like better treatments and all those drugs. Everything is in one RV. But what the thing that they are doing is they can only go to certain villages once a month or like once in 2 months. What we are planning to do is like provide these devices, and the device also has a detachment, like it has a mouthpiece. So you can have individual mouthpieces, and it also biometric capability. It has a biometric capability. So as soon as you hold the device, it recognizes who it is. All you need is, technically you don't even need a laptop or a smart device, because we also have an IoT kit within the device itself that communicates via 4G or your cellular network. So all you have to do is like put this independent device at some place within a village or within a small town where like they can have multiple mouthpieces that's cleanable and it can be reused by other people. But we wanted to give a one for everyone so that they can put it and use it. So what we are trying to do is to like provide such access to like technologies or identify things early with this device, because what happens is most of the time it's even a heart attack, it's a build-up. It's not like something that happens like immediately. It builds up over a period of few days or even weeks sometimes. That's what we are trying to capture. So if there is a problem, we can capture earlier so that these patients or these users can be better managed. And in that way, we also wanted to show some corporate social responsibility in terms of taking our innovation, helping here, helping globally. And that's where we are really working towards also certain organizations in India where it's a great thing that we are part of this panel as well, is because not many people know about patenting, not many people know what they can do with it. There are technologies there are innovations there, but they don't know what to do with that. So that's where we are actually helping them, and I'm looking forward to working with you all to actually enhance that program in different parts of the country in India where there's a lot of innovations there. We can bring in patentability so that there's more value for that, and there's people get some money, people get some interest in doing more things and like patent more things so that it can be monetized to better manage them. So that's what is our focus. We wanted to ensure that we provide value to all the stakeholders in healthcare, not just here, but globally. And in that way, we wanted to also reduce the cost of healthcare in some small way that we can accomplish. So with that mission, we are moving forward right now. As I said, we are working with at least 6 different health systems in the US, 4 pharmaceutical companies, and also in India, 2 health systems. We're also talking to several decision makers in Singapore to help us with. So what I wanted to, I would love to talk more during the panel, but what I wanted to tell you is there's always an opportunity, and as each and every one, I want to request you all to do something to help nurture entrepreneurs, to help next generation innovators, because you guys are doing pretty much a lot of things that are really key for us. Even like there are days when I was struggling to really understand what a patent is. Today we have like at least 4 patents as a part of our company. So for us, what we really want is to nurture innovators, and that's where such projects come in. And I'm really impressed with the value it created for a lot of different countries, where we are seeing every day that new innovations are coming up. Through such projects, there's more transparency and more, it's providing a lens to all these different technologies. I think these initiatives should happen continuously. I would like to end this with a thought, like imagine a patient like my mom, if she can manage herself and monitor herself. Just like last year alone, she had like at least 5 different hospitalizations, which costed more than $70,000 for her. Even if you reduce one hospitalization, that could save like thousands of dollars. And imagine the cost associated with our entire healthcare system. That's going to be the same all around the world. So we as a company has a mission to change the culture of care monitoring. And we want each and every one of you here who believe in us, who loves for your care one, to join us in this mission to empower personalized care. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Adley from Electronic Health Network. You know, my talk isn't as exciting and sexy as like devices. I'm more on the infrastructure side. So even though I think it's fundamental, sometimes it's not as exciting. So we're going to talk about who we are, what we do, our methodology and our approach, then our solution for emerging countries, and what our objective is for the country of Cameroon. So what we do is we really answer the question with the paradigm shift in both reimbursement and care delivery redesign in healthcare today. When you look at emerging technologies in healthcare, you not only have medical records, but you have population health, you have analytics, you've got multiple programs for accountable care organizations, you have programs for macro and MIPS, and it's forcing the physicians to participate in a community. Information has to be shared, data has to be shared, and every single application connected within this now ecosystem needs to be able to communicate. So what we do is we enable that communication through our platform. And what our objective is to now deploy this for the country of Africa, continent of Africa in various countries. So our methodology. If you think about just how we utilize and leverage water today, we have a water system, and we're able to go home, turn on our faucets. If you're in the fire department, you can turn on your fire hoses in a lot of different access to different pressure points. If you're a business, you don't have to think about, you know, building water infrastructure. You just build your business, and that's in essence what we're promoting. If you look at it, by having this water infrastructure in place, you now have these shared services that are available for everybody. So it becomes more cost-effective and economical for you to now put up homes. Look at a home developer. If I were a home developer and I wanted to build homes and then sell these homes for a profit, if I were to have to wrap the cost of actually building an entire water infrastructure, water treatment plant, assigning regulatory requirements for it, the cost of the home that I would pass off to the buyer would be way too expensive, right? So it's not cost effective. But by having this infrastructure already in place, these shared services, it does make it cost effective. So now who are you actually helping? You're not only helping the home builder as the business, you're helping the home buyer because it's now affordable, and everything's regulated, so the water is going to be clean. So our perspective with healthcare is exactly the same. So what we require is really to have some level of infrastructure in place that is able to allow for an ecosystem of applications to be introduced. And then now you're pooling together data. Now whenever you actually roll out a program from immunizations, you're collecting the data, you can track the programs, you can more easily scale your programs. And it becomes more cost effective because whenever you actually bring in an application and you actually do the integration and interoperability, you're not connecting one to one single point and not have to now deploy to like multiple different facilities and integrate with multiple different EMRs. So these are lessons that we've learned with working with healthcare here in the US, that we don't have to replicate the issues there. We can start from scratch. We can just basically start with the new because it doesn't exist now. So we don't have to have any mistakes. So in order to actually do business in the continent of Africa, we understand that we're going to need a team and an approach that, you know, that makes it easy to roll a program into a country. The first thing is that's very important and fundamental is the country needs to be able to want a program to be introduced into their country to change, to improve the health of their people. If they aren't on board that, you know, I need to do this for my citizens and dedicate themselves to it, the program is never going to work. Now, other components are very, very important is number one, you have to have the right people that have the right contacts into these countries, both on the African side and on the US side. So you have to have the partners in place, working with the Chamber of Commerce, the right levels of government in the US that's going to link these two together to give you the introduction so you can scale your program and be able to introduce it. The other is having the right technologies in place. What we're proposing is an ecosystem of technologies, and we're bringing in the infrastructure. We understand that we don't have all the answers, but somebody out there in the world has probably developed something that can be introduced that can really help, and we want to be able to bring all of that to bear. Consulting services. In order to really drive change and improve, you have to focus on a program. So if you look at improving the health of a country, you want to look at HIV, tuberculosis, malaria. Have specific programs that you can leverage the technology to drive those programs and collect that information, but you have to introduce those programs in order to really change the health of the people. You have to move the mark a little bit if you expect the program to be adopted by another country and be able to scale the program as a whole. And finally, which quite possibly might be the most important, is financing. So you're dealing with countries that don't have money and don't have budgets. So you have to answer the question is, how am I going to fund this? And who's going to finance me in order to do this? So in essence, this is what we've done. We partnered with the Dickerson Group that has connections. They are generals that are now working towards improving healthcare in Africa. They have worked in Africa for the past couple of decades. They've got connections into various African countries, have worked in South Africa, are wanting to now work in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Gambia, and all these African countries. Our technology is Mint that we've developed. It's a comprehensive master patient index, data analytics, document repository, image DICOM exchange, data quality, data management that allows for the connectivity and easy integration with multiple applications, so you can now bring this ecosystem to bear. We've partnered with Cisco for two reasons. They are #1 technology partner, because what we want to do is we want to be able to deploy all the technology for the infrastructure onto Cisco routers, be able to deliver those routers on site. So now they're acting as online, offline resources so that you can solve some of the problems you're going to have with energy and downtime. And it builds an actual connectivity intranet of sorts by working with Cisco. And they're also our finance partner. So by bringing these opportunities to Cisco, they'll be able to finance the projects for us. And then Cisco has a plan or how they work with other funding partners in that region, World Health Organization. And when working with Grapevine, they are trying to start and promote a global ecosystem of shared services and applications into the healthcare world. So we've put together the team that is now able to bring solutions into Africa from the perspective of delivering technology, know-how, experience, expertise, and actually have the projects financed. All we need is for the country to say, yes, we were on board and ready to move forward, and we can strike a deal that easy. So what we're trying to do in Cameroon. So we visited Cameroon, we've met with the Minister of Health, and we're now in a process of starting a project there to where what we want to do is start deploying technologies first into their hospitals. They want to focus on medical record systems. And with our objective, what we want to do is we want to layer the medical record on top of the interoperability, first introducing the interoperability. As all data is coming in, we're automatically matching patients, accessing data, aggregating that data, and also making it available so that other applications can communicate with it and integrate with it to start driving more value. And then ultimately take this and start to scale it into various regions of the country until we have now a fully connected community. And the beauty of this is once we connect one country, the connectivity goes to the next country, and they're now also communicating. So we want to promote for the entirety of the continent to be able to communicate not only with themselves internally, but with other countries. And honestly, I'd like to drive it to where they can communicate with the U.S. Hearing the first gentleman speaking, and you're talking about there's shortages of specialists in a lot of these African countries. And we have answers to that today because we have the same problems here today. We're working in California now with a group called Safety Net Connect that has built a stored forward e-consult platform that is a communication point between primary care and specialists. And it's now deployed in all of LA County, and they've actually reduced the time for specialists to be scheduled with patients. And at some points, I've even removed the need for even having a specialist because the communication has answered it. So if you can have a technology that can be deployed, let's say in an African country that doesn't have a lot of specialists, you can always fall back on a US-based specialist network or a UK specialist network to where you can now have, you can answer the question of, if I don't have a lot of doctors to service it. Well, how do I find more doctors in other places that I can just link to answer these questions to help facilitate the program? So these are all the benefits that could come to bear by actually having a connected community of integrated health applications and ecosystems coming to work together. And that's what we do at EHN.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you. There's some really exciting work that's going on, and really a privilege to be here and hear from you guys about what you're accomplishing. I'm Patrick OBrien. I'm with the Global Innovation Policy Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and our job, working with partners like Stephen and Mark and others around the world, is to help to foster the conditions where entrepreneurs like these can succeed. And we think a big part of that is found in the intellectual property model. My unit of the Chamber until recently was the Global Intellectual Property Center. We rebranded at the end of last year to be Innovation Policy. And the reason is, one, we want to speak to policymakers in terms of the outcomes that they want to achieve. But the other is we realize that intellectual property protections like patents, copyrights, trademarks, they protect the end product. Well, we wanted to also get at all of the process of intellectual capital formation. It begins at the very beginning with basic research and research and development. And we've got this research tool that I want to share with you very briefly today. It's called the International IP Index, and it looks at now 50 countries with across 40 indicators that support innovative and creative activity. We think it's very exciting, and then I'll get to the important part, which is why it matters. So let me just walk you through this very briefly. First of all, why have an index? Business leaders always tell us if we can't measure it, we can't improve it. So we wanted to set out to understand what were the factors that businesses were looking at as they made both day-to-day and long-term investment decisions about where and how to operate, where and how to invest, and where and how to bring their innovative and creative products. So we set out to fill what were some significant gaps in our global understanding of IP policy and to provide an objective set of metrics that could show like-to-like comparisons across many countries. Over several years, we've gone from 11 countries measured in 2012 against 25 indicators, now in the most recent version looking at 50 economies and 40 indicators. So for a total possible score of 40 points on this index. And we looked at 8 categories. We looked at patent rights, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets and market access. This year, for the first time, commercialization of IP assets, which I'll come back to in a moment. Enforcement, systemic efficiency, which includes measures that governments take to facilitate domestic innovation and entrepreneurship. And finally, participation in some of the cutting-edge international treaties that are setting the standards globally for intellectual property protection. And in each of these categories, what we look at is, to simplify it a bit, is the basic right in place? So for instance, does a country provide a 20-year term of patent protection in its law? What's the scope of the right? Is it broadly available to all industry sectors? And then, how is it defined? And we look at some specific what I call rule of law measures, which actually, go towards providing the reliability and legal certainty that allows innovators to make the most of their right. So, as I mentioned, what this does now with 50 countries covering virtually every region of the world, every countries of every size, shape, makeup, it really is a very representative index, not in any way restricted to the wealthy countries, but covering 90% of all global economic output. And what this allows us to do, now these are the results for 2018, and so we get a picture of the global intellectual property landscape. And what I want you to take away from this slide is not, whether China does better than India or, India does better than Pakistan. Forget about that for a moment. and just reflect on the fact that 25 years after the World Trade Organization negotiated the TRIPS agreement, that's the sort of the basic standard setting agreement on the multilateral level for countries on IP rights. 25 years after that agreement was implemented, no two countries score the same score. They're all different. And in fact, if you look at, more closely at these scores, you'll find that even where they're close together numerically, they might have vast differences in how they handle copyrights or trademarks or trade secrets or patents. So really, every country in the world at this point, or at least the 50 that we're looking at here, which are representative of the world, are making independent, sovereign policy decisions about how and to what degree to protect intellectual property. Now, the important point about this, is that those decisions matter. And so I want to, stop for a second on, what I like to call the innovation equation, because I think it reflects two separate mindsets that seem to be at work around the world. On the one hand, you have the reward model equation that sees innovation coming first. We sort of take it for granted. Innovation happens everywhere, after all, right? You add IP as a reward to the innovator, and you get a cost. Another way of thinking about this, what I would think of as the more productive way of thinking about it, this is a rights model equation. You set the conditions through intellectual property laws backed up by a strong property right and the rule of law that enables investment, and the result is innovative output. So which one is right? I'll tell you, neither one is right or wrong. It's actually a public policy choice. Countries with the policy decisions that they make about how they protect IP determine where IP goes in the innovation equation. Too many countries are going with the reward model. In the United States, historically, in much of Europe and Japan and now Singapore, it's the rights model, and we really have to defend that and promote that model because that's what results in socially transformative innovation. After 6 editions of this index, we have a lot of data around it, and we're able to draw some conclusions about what it means. So what we've done since 2014, we've added a statistical annex to this index that looks at the correlations between IP strength in a given country on the one hand and its performance against a set of socioeconomic indicators that include R&D spending by the private sector, innovator access to venture capital, rates of foreign direct investment into the countries. These on the input side. On the output side, growth of high-tech sectors, access to innovative and creative products, services, and technologies, as well as the overall business environment. And what we found was across the board, as countries moved up that chain, that index, step by step, they saw better results on all of these different indicators: jobs created in knowledge-intensive industries, spending on R&D, presence of researchers in the market, basic human capital. So here, looking specifically at 2 related to the healthcare space, in terms of the number of researchers in a given country who are looking for innovation in healthcare, and on the other hand, access to new medical technology with clinical trial activity as a proxy. You can see in both cases that as countries invest in a stronger system, they tend to see better results. So this is the IP index. We hope that it, and we've actually found in practice that when we talk to policymakers around the world about this, that there is a growing acknowledgement that we all need to invest in strong intellectual property systems. It is not something we do in India so that American healthcare companies get paid. It's something that we do in India and China and Indonesia so that we can have innovation at home and so that we can have access to innovative products and services technologies at home. That's, really the inspiration is guys like these and the work that they're doing, and really appreciate the invitation to join you. Thanks.
All right. I'll ask my fellow co-panelists to take the stage here.
as I mentioned at the outset, we do have a reception hour to follow from 5 to 6. So we'll have 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we can have some libations. I certainly want to elicit questions from the audience, so please be thinking about what you'd like to ask this esteemed crew. I'll open it, though, with a couple questions. First, was there anything that was said by one of your fellow co-panelists that you'd like to pick up on or elaborate or extend upon?
I loved what Fyodor is doing in terms of the day-to-day healthcare. It's not just access to healthcare when you need it. It's that monitoring and the building up of data. We're entering a new age when it's we're really transforming the way we deliver healthcare. And so I was interested in how that's working in practice. Are you getting enough data? Is it changing even the way that your business model is evolving?
Yeah, I mean, the real fact is the adherence is a major challenge. So that's why we're trying to make sure it's as simple as possible for the patients. And we also wanted to show them the value that collecting this data every day has shown to them in terms of, for example, a COPD patient. For them, not showing them, oh, here's your lung function value, which is not going to make any sense to them, but rather what we are showing is, here's your lung age. Today, you're 50 years old, but your lung age is 70 or 80 today. By monitoring yourself and better managing yourself, over a period of a few weeks, they can see their lung age reducing to 60. So which is kind of like pushing them to work harder because, hey, I'm 50 years old, I want my lungs to be younger and then active. So that's what is the incentive that we are providing for them to do it. Although there's a lot of challenges to have them use it every day, but still, like even if they're using occasionally, we're getting more meaningful data points than the current existing tools. So in that way, what we are doing is we're doing our best to represent the data to the providers so that they can also communicate with them every single time they visit. So considering all these things, the rich data is really helping us to map the human, like we call it the digitome of information, completely collecting all the information associated with the patients so that it'll be a repository for future medical care.
Good.
So, in the U.S., we have a culture of entrepreneurs, it seems like, and there's always a way to find out information around intellectual property. How do you do it? How do you start a business? So what if you're like this gentleman that's in Cameroon that's developing a brand new technology or something like that's whiz-bang? Like, how do they know even to IP protect something? How do they get access to this information?
Well, so that's interesting. One of the slides I pointed to with respect to our index is what we call the systemic efficiency of a country's intellectual property system. And a number of countries that we're working with, Indonesia and India being two prominent examples, have actually launched fairly robust intellectual property awareness initiatives domestically, at a state and local level, specifically to raise awareness of IP rights and to facilitate registration of those rights among domestic entrepreneurs. So that's something we want to encourage. And I wanted, in that same sort of vein, you had a slide up that showed like all the partners that you had to work with to bring a product to market. And I think what we need to keep in mind is how intellectual property rights facilitate those partnerships. As a small business, you often have to go externally to access financing, to contract marketing, to do all the things that go into actually bringing a product to market. But even in a large company, you have those same sort of transactional relationships. You have to convince your CEO that you've got a work stream that's going to lead to a profitable product. You've got to convince your marketing department and your research department to invest time and resources in these. So these are all commercial transactions, in effect, that have to take place, whether you're a small business or a large business, in order to go from great idea to product that can reach a patient. when you have a strong property right, then you have a reliable basis to make that investment.
You know, in response to your question, one thought I have is that that these are the kind of interventions, policy interventions, that are really cost effective. You know, in the development economics studies, that's one thing they've found, that you know, rather than, say, subsidizing businesses or giving grants, a short-term investment in developing human capital around a piece of knowledge, like you go out and you teach people in an industry how to export, what's involved in exporting, what you end up with is a knowledge base that spreads through the industry and perpetuates itself. And I've seen that happen in the creative industries with, say, South Korea and South Africa, both investing in the capability of people to do film work. You know, the post-production work has helped bolster their creative industries, their film and television industries, because that knowledge base perpetuates itself. And so it strikes me that it's the kind of intervention we could advocate for that is, in the long run, cost effective, because once entrepreneurs understand the value of IP, once you have some IP attorneys in a country, this is something that will sustain itself. It doesn't require outside money or the government feeding it money on a long-term basis.
So from a policy perspective, or for NGOs or other entities, what more can be done to unlock the potential of innovators and entrepreneurs working on life sciences and innovative healthcare solutions in these countries? Is it more STEM education? Is it, you know, one thing that occurs to me is there's such great knowledge today about the process of innovation, right? There's like the 10 types of innovation, Larry Keeley, there's the business model canvas, there's design thinking as a structured methodology. Are we diffusing this knowledge set about the methods of innovation out into the developing world and empowering people to tackle local challenges?
Well, for us, it's going to be part of our model, but it's how do you find the right resources? How do you get the right programs, right NGOs? Because for a country to sustain itself and for the country to actually benefit, like we always believe in, teach a man how to fish. So you want the people in the country to be able to manage their own technology, develop their own programs, so that they can learn and then ultimately scale that out. So I think like having more of a resource here that could assist with that directly, offer us information, where to go to, who to partner with, like just to make the process easier, would be really, really beneficial.
So it's interesting, one of the initiatives that the Chamber is working on now, we were brought in by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to sort of reconstitute a U.S. delegation to an international standards organization project to create an innovation management standard. So this is an ongoing thing. 29 countries have come together, and in different working groups. Only one of them related to intellectual property. They've got IP professionals building out processes that small businesses could follow to have a more innovative culture within their own companies. So sort of taking sort of these broad concepts of innovation and making it very granular and accessible.
Great. So, we were excited to do this original research and to find these examples. How is the international community doing a sufficient job of collecting, harvesting, and disseminating these types of great stories, tools, and technologies out into the broader world? It seems to me this should be the first priority of the World Health Organization, not putting forward papers that are suggesting that intellectual property can be an access to medicines, but do the tool sets exist to get these solutions out to the people who need them? What could we be doing better in that regard?
Well, I think we need to make more of an emphasis to let Americans know that they really need to go out and try to seek business abroad. Like if you go to Africa, you're going to see a lot of Chinese companies there. There are a lot of foreign companies there, and we're not really represented. So I think we need to do something on our side to make it easier for companies to go do business there. and just let people know that if we do not, we're really, as Americans, are going to miss out on a great opportunity.
Yeah, the private sector has a big responsibility here.
Yeah. No, even yesterday I was part of an initiative in Boston where a Chinese group of investors and innovators, they came into US and then they were trying to tap into the technologies here. They wanted to invest here and then get value back to their country. But only in the US, we still looking and then like looking at us as the only innovators there. But there should be more programs in which they can go leverage the opportunities within India or Africa. As you said, at least the Gate Foundation, I know they are doing a lot of things, specifically working with rural India, where I know some of my friends who were like assisted through Gates Foundation, getting some investment to actually build some devices. Now they're getting the opportunity to come here. I think it's basically on both sides. From the US perspective, they don't know that there's innovation out there in other parts of the world. And from the other parts of the world, they still lack that knowledge that, is this patentable? Is this something that which we can really use it? Because I know, I mean, even my dad, he's an engineer, he had a lot of different ideas which just died in his garage where he built on it. So that's where today when I look at it, oh, these are things my dad thought about it like 30, 40 years ago, which could have really changed a lot of different things. So that lack of like education from both the sides is kind of, we need to find a bridge. I think China is doing a lot in terms of bridging that gap. Maybe other countries should catch up too.
Really, this is an infrastructure issue, right? I mean, in any given country, do you have the infrastructure to help entrepreneurs who have an idea take it to market as a product? I mean, I think that infrastructure is the intellectual property system. And part of the challenge we have is overcoming this mindset that IP is about paying someone else instead of helping you to get your idea to market. And the reason, I think it goes back to why the US has been so successful economically for such a long period of time, is we do have open markets, we have strong private property rights, and we have rule of law to back them up. And to think that that doesn't apply to the knowledge economy, to innovative and creative products, is silly. I mean, Meridian Center buys a lot of glasses or pads or napkins. If I sell those things, then we can do business. But if my ownership of the glass or the napkin or the pen is in question, then we can't do business. Mm-hmm. That's no less true for a great idea than it is for a physical product.
We got to know you two gentlemen through Startup Health and the Moonshot Academy. Would you just tell us a bit about what Startup Health is doing? And I know there's a whole portfolio of companies that Mark and colleagues are working with. What is that initiative trying to accomplish?
No, I think Startup Health has been like really wonderful for us because when we started off, we didn't have any idea. Like we were like me and my co-founder trying to figure out like how we can just build this company. We have an amazing product. What can we do? So Startup Health actually came in like very early. We approached them, and we've been working since then with every single aspect. What is a real unique thing about it is like they're building a transformer. They call it the health transformer community, where they have all these entrepreneurs and companies working together, collaborating in such a way that is not like having any conflicts between them, but rather more on a friendly basis. Because most of the time, if I have any question, because we are kind of an early stage company, but then there are a lot of other companies at a later stage, and then they've gone through the same path. Oftentimes it was like just a call or just a Slack message really helped me to connect with those entrepreneurs to get those insights, so that like from an entrepreneur's perspective, the biggest thing that we have is the time, the most precious thing, which we don't want to be wasting like doing things repeatedly. So that's where Startup Health, the Moonshot Academy is basically, there's like 10 different moonshots focused on access to care, cost to zero, and then curing cancer, and a bunch of other things where they segregated these companies into different moonshots. Like several companies have multiple moonshots, but basically they're putting all these moonshots together so that by in the next 15 to 20 years, we wanted to have the biggest army of entrepreneurs who are solving these major healthcare problems, not just in the US, but around the world. So that's the really interesting part about Startup Health compared to other incubators that are out there.
I really like Startup Health because they have a global framework in place. And their objective is to really help all entrepreneurs in healthcare technology around the world. And healthcare as a business is very niche within itself. And there are a handful of very, very large players that really dominate the market. And having the ability or an organization that then pulls all these people together, all these like young developers, early or later stage, to communicate, to build relationships, they come to your side as a partner. So you look at them as I'm going and trying to identify an opportunity, win this opportunity, look for investment. They help you with every stage of the process. So they're more of a partner with you in this endeavor, and not just an incubator. And just in healthcare, it really helps because you need that. You need to talk to more entrepreneurs. You need to be able to meet with investors. You need to be able to open more doors, not only here but globally. And I think they provide a platform that really drives that, and it's a huge help.
That's fantastic. You know, one thing that one of the reasons why it's so important to incubate startups. We talked about Arthur Zhang and CardioPad. So now he's launched a company called Highmore Medical, and he's leading the charge for development of a cluster in Cameroon serving Central Africa, making medical devices. So they've moved on from the electrocardiograms now to ultrasound and other medical device testing equipment. So we're seeing these entrepreneurs now driving the development of broader clusters, which are driving economic growth and job creation across developing countries, and that's just so vitally important. Do we have a question from the audience? I'll call on you. Mark's actually a professor, so he'll actually do it. That actually worked. I got to use that in the future. Go ahead, sir. Just if you would say your name and who you're with.
Thanks. Sure. Andrew Redmond with Monarch Global Strategies. I was curious in terms of the case studies, and I guess sort of thinking in a chicken and egg sense almost. Is there any, or have anyone encountered resistance? Because all of these innovations, or a lot of them, are disruptive, or they're certainly changing the way things are done, and there can be resistance. And I appreciate your thoughts. It strikes me that to some extent, the innovations demonstrate the value of more innovation, but if there's a lot of resistance, not even talking about the concept of IP, but just resistance to changing the way you practice medicine, that's going to stifle the innovation. So I was just curious if you saw anything like that in the case studies.
So, the nature of where we focused, I think, meant that for the most part, you didn't see that kind of resistance because they were filling such large gaps. And many of the physicians I've talked to who practiced in developing countries, and some of them I know from their having moved to the US to practice here, one of their frustrations is so many of these access issues. They don't see people until it's too late to do something. So when there's something like CardioPad or other inventions like this that allow them to get to people sooner and help them, I think they welcome it. The challenge, I think, what we see though, is there's a great potential for innovation to flow from the global south to the global north, as in some ways they leapfrog the existing infrastructure and develop things like the Peak eye exam kit with a cell phone and point of care diagnostics. What you run into in the developed world is, of course, that's resistance because you have a regulatory infrastructure that assumes there are certain ways of doing things and is less likely to change fast. And you have doctors who've invested in a lot of equipment they're still probably trying to pay off in many cases. So I think those are some of the challenges. And indeed, the path dependence, people are comfortable with what they know. Steve, do you have?
There was one case study in the report, if you want to go delve into it, called NephroPlus, a company in India developing solutions to people who lose their kidney function, which affects 12 million people in India and kills 230,000 a year. This company, NephroPlus, kind of developed a 56-step process, was much more efficient, much more effective, and apparently they carved in on the existing provider of these services, which is a much more cost-effective solution. And there was some rigmarole about approval for the innovative solution from the Indian public healthcare system. I think they ultimately worked it out, but it was a case of the incumbents were trying to block the innovators.
Thank you for all your presentations. I had two sets of questions. One question is, in your, I guess, research, did you find statistics about where most, I guess, innovators in developing countries are filing their patents? Do they file nationally, regionally, or do they try to file in the US? And then I wondered, did you also come across information about how do they pay for, the filing of those IP rights? Because usually research is publicly funded, but public funding usually doesn't cover IP. And then when you go and look for investments, then you need to have your IP. So I'm just wondering, how usually do they pay for their IP rights registration? And then my second question would be related to when reversing, bringing south innovations to the north. I was wondering, how can affordability be preserved? I guess if you have like a $2 or $40 diagnostic instrument or method, when it comes back to the US, does it stay kind of at the same price?
You want me to answer the filing issue?
Sure.
On the first set of questions, we saw a lot of countries, a lot of these businesses did focus on the U.S. and Europe, kind of what we might call the big patent offices to file their patents and protect their rights, because those are the markets where they're likely to make money and have their rights protected. And so this is a challenge that filing at home often doesn't get a business as much as they might hope for. And so, but one thing we found, not in this study, but there's some other recent research that the Center for Protection of Intellectual Property sponsored by a researcher who wrote about what he called patent tigers, and he wrote about how a number of innovative countries with smaller markets such as Taiwan and Malaysia and Singapore, had benefited from using the U.S. patent system, and that they were really strong strategic filers in the U.S. because they understood that they could drive their own innovative economy by innovating and working toward the larger economy, the U.S., and where they could certainly protect their rights. So I think you see that entrepreneurs who are savvy and work with savvy investors understand this. How do they pay for it? It's the same challenge that I think of startups anywhere pay for, and that I saw when I was a practicing lawyer and worked with startups, is you're usually, as an entrepreneur, you're spending money on building your product first. But once you start to try to get investors interested, you might scrape together the money to file a patent. And then what you kind of hope is you end up in an iterative process where maybe your angel investors your first investors help you then get the money to do your filings, and proof, and that validates, as Steve's slide said, validates for further investment by having those initial patent applications at least. But it is challenging. It's not cheap to file a patent.
What I think, what we're seeing here in the United States is, as the Supreme Court has restricted patent eligibility for certain sectors, and legal certainty around a patent has been undermined to a certain degree by post-grant opposition proceedings, that, while the U.S. market remains a priority for most businesses, they may file first somewhere else today. And China in particular has sort of worked to take some of that business.
The second to last case study talks about the experience of companies like Philips and GE operating in India. And they've actually been forced to have to use this process of jugaad, or kind of innovating an environment of constraints in India. They introduced something called the MESI, which was their version of a local electrocardiogram for the Indian market that was 1/5 of the prior cost of the version. So it's interesting to see innovators like Arthur Zhang forcing the large companies to actually, develop solutions that are far more cost effective and, supply the baseline needs for the environment. And I think you are seeing in other instances where that competition, which actually plays out in developing countries, now recycles back to the north, and you're seeing companies bring innovative, more effective, more efficient and cost-effective solutions to market. That was actually the case in a number of the infant warmer example, the nanobiozyme, the Zika. Actually, that was invented for Brazil, but then it turned out like Florida was demand. There was a massive demand in Florida, for instance. So yeah, a lot of cases like that. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think that we should all grab a glass of wine if we'd like. I want to thank again the Global Innovation Policy Center for being so kind to secure the space for us here at the Meridian International Center. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to CPIP for hosting the reception. Thank you to all of our panelists for being with us this afternoon and giving great remarks. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks for a great report.